Hi there, I'm Doy Santos, and you're on the cusp. On this edition, we're going to be answering the question: how do the yellow forces deal with the populist backlash? In the first part of this series, we showed how the weakening of democratic institutions in the country can be traced to the establishment of neoliberal economic policies, which have given rise to a populist backlash. The Philippine debt driven crony capitalist growth of the 1970s, under President Marcos, led to the IMF prescribed austerity measures of the 1980s, under President Cory Aquino, and the globalist trend of the 1990s, under President Fidel Ramos. The Philippine state and its economy was too weak for it to say no to the imposition of policies from external lenders. This led to a populist backlash from the left in 1998, in the wake of the Asian financial crisis. The election of President Joseph Erap Estrada was a response to the austerity under which the government had to spend more on its debt service than on education, contrary to our constitutional provisions. It was also based on Erap's charisma and cult of personality. In reality, Erap's presidency suffered from the same duality present under Marcos, where technocrats pursued reforms on the one hand, while a midnight cabinet of cronies took advantage of their proximity to power on the other. The situation became untenable after their illegal intent was uncovered. The country's liberal forces rallied and installed Gloria Macapagal Arroyo to replace Estrada. Arroyo, herself a technocrat, vigorously pursued fiscal reforms that allowed the country to weather the global financial crisis. But she became immensely unpopular, not just for imposing higher taxes or unseating the popular Estrada, but also due to the shenanigans of her husband and her generals, which she couldn't control. The presidency of Benigno Aquino III was meant to carry on the reforms of the Aquino Ramos era, but his weakness as a leader led to analysis paralysis, as exhibited by his response to serious natural disasters and security threats. He kept Mrs. Arroyo's reforms in social welfare, education, and health, but his unwillingness to undertake major tax reforms hamstrung his ability to invest in infrastructure. This led to a populist backlash from the right and was a situation tailor-made for Rodrigo Duterte. His tough-on-crime record in Davao led to a different sort of personality cult, not based on the man of the people trope that was Estrada's shtick, but based on him being a man of action who gets the job done at all costs and by any means necessary, even if it meant running roughshod over the rights of some people. If in the developed world, populism came about because of economic stagnation, as is the case in the United States, where globalization and automation have caused real median wages of workers to remain flat over the last 50 years, in the developing world, populism stems from the effects of economic convergence. As a middle class emerges in the developing world, challenges associated with a rapidly growing labor pool, crowding into urban centers, putting pressure on infrastructure, and becoming more susceptible to droughts, epidemics, and the effects of climate change in the process, is causing public anxiety and frustration over the slow rate at which governments keep up with these demands. The yellow forces don't get any thanks for instituting the painful reforms from Aquino to Ramos that have led to the country's virtuous cycle of growth. Instead, they became victims of their own success. So when Mar Rojas said that the traffic in Metro Manila was a sign of economic growth, he was stating a fact. But instead of being thanked for generating that growth, he got hammered for failing to accommodate it with better regulation and better infrastructure. This is an important point, which I'd like to stress, because the yellow forces have all but abandoned the good economic reform legacy of the Aquino Ramos period by opposing tax reforms since the time of President Gloria Arroyo. They've been super cautious not to be outflanked on the left, as per what happened with Erap Estrada, that they themselves have pandered to populist sentiment, pushing for social spending that would become unsustainable without appropriate revenue-raising fiscal measures. Duterte, for his part, has combined pro-poor populism with economic rationalism. He has somehow balanced populist measures like the increase of senior pensions and free irrigation, as well as universal tertiary education and healthcare, which are designed to pay off key constituents to allow for unpopular but necessary tax reforms to be passed to fund infrastructure projects. On the one hand, he's able to pander to populist sentiment from seniors and students, but is also able to push for a fuel excise tax hike and a sugar tax, as well as an expansion of the value-added tax by removing exemptions, while making personal income taxes lower and more competitive. The Liberal Party opposed these measures, by and large, while questioning the government's borrowings from overseas to fund much-needed infrastructure, stoking conspiracy theories over China's Belt and Road Initiative in the process, which border on xenophobia. This made them look opportunistic and obstructionist. Their response to the traffic gridlock nowadays in our cities is to sponsor a Magna Carta for commuters in the Senate. Now, this cements the ineffectual nature of their governance style that was so evident under Noynoy's presidency. Duterte's economic team are simply carrying on with the reform agenda begun under the Ramos and Aquino presidencies, but have been doing it in a way that addresses the backlash from the left by expanding social programs along with fiscal and economic measures. The opposition could have collaborated constructively with the administration and said there is a unity ticket on the fiscal and economic reform packages. They had started it after all. They could have claimed the mantle, but they chose instead the easy path of populism. Bam Aquino's economic narrative around entrepreneurship and building a highly creative, well-educated middle class needed to be bolstered by a record of responsible, prudent fiscal management, which he undermined when he opposed the train law. Now, I'm not saying this is what cost him the votes. What I am saying is that Duterte would probably not have attacked him so vehemently during the campaign if he had supported the administration's fiscal and economic reform agenda, and that's what cost him the votes. By protecting its left flank and fighting yesterday's battles, the opposition didn't realize that it was being outflanked on its right. The rising middle class, who demand better infrastructure and protection because their main concern is getting to work and home safely and on time, not having to sacrifice too much time away from their families due to their commute, elected Duterte, hoping he would disrupt things and untangle the gridlock of our streets and enforce some discipline to bring about order out of the chaos. The opposition's obstructionism made them seem more part of the problem rather than a necessary part of the solution. So now that we have properly diagnosed the problem, it's worth talking about the solution. How do the yellow forces address this populist backlash from the right? To address this, let's perform a simple thought experiment first. Imagine that Duterte hadn't pursued his war on drugs and didn't flirt with declaring a revolutionary government. His administration would have been seen as fitting within the mold of the yellow regime. In fact, on economic policy, there's a remarkable continuity from the reforms of Aquino Ramos down to Arroyo and now to Duterte. Only those on the progressive side who were opposed to capitalism would be opposed to such a reform agenda. Even social democrats who are pro-capitalist but seek to smoothen its rough edges by distributing some of its benefits would recognize the efforts being made to provide greater universal access to education and health as sound. So now it comes down to Duterte's war on drugs, where the battle lines are drawn. But yellow forces conveniently forget another thing. Cory Aquino had once unofficially endorsed Alfredo Lim over a Laban stalwart in Mel Lopez for the mayorship of Manila back in 1992. She reportedly favored him as president in 1998 as well, when he lost against Erap Estrada. Yes, Fred, Dirty Harry, Lim, who waged the same sort of war against crime and drugs in Manila, using the same sort of vigilante-style killings, was an ally of Cory Aquino. Let that sink in for a minute. He led the police forces that fired on farmers massing at Mendiola during the time of Cory. He also helped stop the coups launched against her government. Noynoy was with Mayor Lim during the Luneta siege, remember? And he defended the actions taken by the mayor after that debacle. So what's the difference between Fred Lim and Rudy Duterte, you might ask? The reality is, it just boils down to style. Lim never swore at the Pope. He never requested women to come on stage and give him a kiss. He never used gutter language or made references to the Holocaust. Let's face it, impunity didn't start with Duterte. It occurred at Mendiola and in Hacienda Luisita and in countless other places. No one was ever tried for those massacres, by the way. Oh yes, Lim was investigated, but then cleared of any responsibility. The nanlaban argument was also used back then. The only difference is that Lim never ran against a chosen one of the Yellow Forces. He ran against Jose de Venecia and Erap Estrada. Not exactly black and white. Whereas Duterte ran against Pinoy's chosen successor, Mar Rojas, so he was labeled a traitor. Once we get over the false ideological divide that the Yellow Forces have constructed, we will find that the differences between the two camps are relatively small and quite petty. Duterte was a Dilawan, after all, under President Noynoy Aquino. His mother was a member of the Yellow Coalition that toppled Marcos. He represents one strand of that coalition that does the dirty work for it. That those on the top of that coalition who project an image of purity avoid to acknowledge needs to be done under our flawed judicial system. The challenge now is, can the Yellow Forces open a third act? They've dealt with populism from the left in the past by instituting reforms that have produced economic growth and expanded the state's capacity to spend on social programs. But can they deal with populism from the right by doing the same for infrastructure, public safety, and security? It's not exactly their brand, so how will they do it? Well, first of all, they need to stop being cheapskates. Stop trying to do things on the fly like those public toilets with no cubicles, or those post-Yolanda houses that look like shantytowns, or by buying Mahindra Jeeps from India that break down, or purchasing trains that don't fit the tracks they're supposed to run on. Stop trying to have things both ways, or being on both sides of the argument. Embrace the fact that you need new and better taxes to pay for these things. Embrace the fact that you need to increase defense assets if you want to secure our borders, or else we will be unable to prevent unauthorized incursions into our waters by foreign ships. Embrace the fact that the judicial system needs reform, or else extrajudicial killings will be the only way some people will obtain security and justice. Embrace the fact that our political system needs reform, or else corruption, money, and politics will continue to reign. The beauty of the situation now, however, is that because of the painful reforms already undertaking during the time of Aquino Ramos, and under Arroyo Duterte. The Philippines is experiencing an era of unprecedented growth. The task now is to design policies and platforms that continue lifting the broad sections of our society out of poverty and into the middle class. And once they're there, providing them with enough safety and protections to secure themselves, their property, and their way of life. This type of statecraft cannot take place if our political parties are weak and subservient to corporate patrons. After the financial and economic reforms of the last 30 years, serious political and electoral reforms are needed now to move the Philippines away from the patronage system into becoming a more modern state. Strong, independent political parties with self-sufficient sources of funds provided by the state are needed to prevent legislators from being captured by vested interests, the way some business tycoons sponsor or even operate their own parties today. The Philippines is on the cusp of being an upper middle income nation in a few years. It can certainly afford this reform now. This will prevent populism in the future that is based on a cult of personality. Once we have moved our democracy into the modern era, where parties can independently design policies, programs, and projects with proper costings, as they do in advanced democracies, and field candidates on the basis of merit rather than blood relations. For the longest time, the yellow forces have avoided renovating our political institutions simply because they relied on a thesis that for our nation to be prosperous, all it needs is for virtuous people to lead. The meek and the mild aren't always the type who get things done, or who challenge the status quo. This has led to another argument that asserts that what we need are people with political will. The will to go so far as to subvert the current system to get things done. So unless those who possess the virtue realize that the system is being subverted by people with wealth and power, their terms of office will expire without them doing much. Whatever progress they make just gets swept away by the next regime. Yes, there are many things to fix. The judicial system, our defense posture against geopolitical forces, our health, education, local government, immigration, transport, telecom, water, power, you name it. But the first step, the one that ensures that the best ideas from the best and brightest arise, is fixing our political and electoral system. That is the foundation on which everything else is built. No, strengthening political parties with conditional cash grants, conditional because they will have to comply with certain regulations on how they spend it and how they augment it, will not directly benefit anyone among the voting public, unlike free tuition or free irrigation, for instance. But it will indirectly benefit everyone because of the truly representative and democratic system it will create. It's not sexy. You can't create a bumper sticker, a hashtag, or a slogan saying, "Political party reform now." But instituting this reform would be a sign of real maturity. Marcos, Estrada, Arroyo, and Duterte are not the real enemy. They're only but a distraction. Getting rid of them won't solve our problem. Marcos was a sign that all was not well with the old republic. After EDSA, the yellow forces tried to fix it. But in compromising with the more conservative forces within their ranks, they merely restored the previous order that preceded Marcos. They did a half-assed job, in other words, half-baked. That meant it was only a matter of time before another Marcos surfaced to shake the EDSA Republic to its core. It's time that we recognized what the Philippines is: a plutarchy with populist tendencies. You have the rich and famous, the dynasties lording it over Congress and business, fixing the rules of the game to suit their interests. They use populism to bribe the electorate to keep them in power. Even if the occupant of Malacanang has noble intentions, that person won't get anything done without dancing to their tune. The irony is that there is now multi-party support for political party reform in Congress, with multiple bills pending. That is because every major party, from PDP Laban to Lakas, PMP, and the Liberal Party, have experienced the pain of moving from administration to opposition by now. They've all suffered the same fate of seeing their party mates switch to the other side. So why doesn't any administration certify this legislation as urgent? Well, because once in power, every administration falls into the same pitfall of hubris, of thinking it will be there and be able to manage a political succession within its own ranks and stay in power. So, with the lack of foresight, each administration has simply squandered its time in office, dealing with the urgent, not really attending to the necessary. Except for once, the administration has seen defections even while it is in power. PDP Laban lost 10 members to NUP in the House, which is funded by a business tycoon and has attracted the president's congressman's son. PDP Laban has tried to smuggle political party reform through a new constitution, but that is not really necessary, as Congress can pass these reforms through normal legislation. Why not push for it now, while they still have the most seats in Congress? While you're in power, you can buy loyalty with positions, money, and projects, but when you're out of power, you've got nothing, unless you craft a law that provides funding to parties based on their performance at the last election, regardless of whether members switch parties at the next one. The very essence of people empowerment should mean that any Juan de la Cruz can run for public office and have an equal chance of winning compared to the scion of a political dynasty. Juan or Juana shouldn't have to be a matinee idol or a famous athlete to break into the magic circle. Parties should be able to nominate candidates based on merit, not on whether they have the financial capacity or the name recall. Otherwise, we're just kidding ourselves, calling ourselves a democracy, when in reality we aren't. We might as well have a benevolent dictator who can bring these vested interests to heel, rather than let them rule the country. If we want to prevent another populist dictator from arising, then what we have to do is reform our political party institutions. Take corporate money and big business out of politics through state funding, we can afford it now, and bring our electoral system into the modern era. So that's it. Thank you for listening. This has been another edition of The Cusp. I'm Doy Santos. See you next time.